Couldn't print my notes, so if I'm staring at a phone, I apologize. That sounds good. I'll just give a second for the folks are joining on Zoom. So welcome everybody. My name's Emily Roding. My pronouns are she, her. I have my name tag in case you forget. And I'm the Executive Director of the Brain Injury Association of Nova Scotia. I also don't do well with the heat, so if I'm very red, that is why on a day like today. Our team can tell you that I've been looking forward to this session for a number of weeks now, so I'm really pleased to welcome you here on this beautiful hot sunny day, which is the first day of Brain Injury Awareness Month, and we're hosting it here, of course, in beautiful Chipuktuk or Halifax. Our association in Nova Scotia is based on the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people, so I'm sure most of you are from Nova Scotia and are very aware of that. We're governed by the Truth and Friendship Treaties, and we're so grateful to be able to share this land, to work, and to live. As you all know, we're here to talk about a topic that we haven't really explored much in this area, which is the connection between intimate partner violence, brain injuries, and mental health. I know there are lots of you in this room and folks who are joining us online, welcome, who know better than I do about the trauma of intimate partner violence, or IPV, as we often call it. It's something that predominantly impacts women and non-binary folks across our province and really around the world. Intersecting identities, such as being an Indigenous woman or a Black woman or a woman with a disability or all of the above, puts you at higher risk of IPV. And as Danielle will outline in part of her presentation, also puts you at higher risk for a traumatic brain injury, which can have very long lasting and far reaching impacts. With that in mind, the topics that we're going to touch on today are pretty heavy, for lack of a better term. So if you ever need to step out, please feel free, come back in when you feel comfortable. I'll also use that as a slightly awkward segue, that if you need to step out to use the washrooms, you just go out and then turn to the right and you'll see the symbol there. For the folks joining online, hopefully you know where your washrooms are located. But if you do have any technical issues, please feel free to send the host a message in the chat and we'll help you from there. We will have the opportunity for question and answer, because I'm sure that Danielle's presentation will kind of trigger a lot of questions for folks. So we will open up the floor for that for people in the room, and those joining online, you can use the Q&A box anytime you like to type a question in, and we'll relay those to the presenter at the end. Finally, just want to take a quick moment to recognize the folks who helped put this together today. First and foremost, to the team at Brain Injury Nova Scotia. We have Sam and Marley in the room here with us, and Chloe isn't here quite yet, but might be joining later. Thank you to all of them. Also to our colleagues at the Saskatchewan Brain Injury Association, represented here by Executive Director Glenda James, the Canadian Women's Foundation, and the Canadian Royal Purple Society, who all helped to sponsor and make this event happen today. The Canadian Royal Purple Society has made their national cause promoting awareness of brain injuries, in particular those connected to intimate partner violence. I'm pleased to welcome the Royal Purple Society's national president, Sandy Lougheed, whose name I hope I pronounced correctly, who is going to introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Emily. For the last year, beginning in Strathmore, Alberta, thanks to the funding from the Canadian Women's Foundation, we have been involved in 4 symposiums like this across Canada. Very fitting that the last one should in fact be on Thursday and be on the first day of Brain Injury Awareness Month. So I'm going to give you a brief outline of what the Royal Purple's involvement, what the Canadian Royal Purple's involvement is. And it's basically all about Purple Thursday. Not that you could tell from my shirt. Purple Thursday, the 3rd Thursday in October, is the result of the coming together of the research professionals, a nation of volunteers, and a group of brain injury associations across Canada. Finally, we have brain injury facts about women. We have statistics. We have truth statements. We have proof that brain injury awareness and women and the intersection of brain injuries and interpartner violence occurs. The statistics really become the change agents for us. They become the change agents in the hands of volunteers. And briefly, that's what I'm here to talk to you about today, is the role of the volunteer. You're going to get lots of the professional aspect as well. But for volunteers, those facts, those statistics are what enable us to become change agents. They provide us with the catalyst that make us want to change, and they want to make, and for us to want to make our world better. And so as volunteers, as parents, we can buy the helmets. We can be smart around farm machinery. And we can be smart around the electronic kids' toys that go faster than most of us went in our lifetime on our bicycles. And we can exhibit respectful behavior in our family relationships. And as voters, we can insist on funding and changes to legislation and recognition of our cause. But for all of this to happen in the world of a volunteer, there has to be a critical mass, a group of people who become aware and understand and care enough to understand that we need to care about brain injuries and their causes. In addition, there has to be a group who make the world aware of the issues and believes that all we know to be true, that the only cure is prevention in the first place. So there will always be accidents, but causes such as brain injuries due to interpersonal violence are 100% preventable. You think about that, 100% preventable. And so now we come to Purple Thursday. We began it last October to bring attention to those statistics. You think about it, 1 in 3 women have encountered interpersonal violence, whether it's being hit or strangled. And 80% of those, now 1 in 4, will have suffered a brain injury. What more powerful statistic do we need to have in order to have a purpose and a cause? All of these women, men, and children's lives are being impacted by activity, again, that is 100% preventable. And so one day out of 365, Purple Thursday, the 3rd Thursday in October, seems way too few, but for us, it's a start. That 3rd Thursday, the Canadian Royal Purple will help draw Canada's attention to this cause. Over 3,000 care bags will be delivered to shelters from now coast to coast, because for the last week, we've been establishing Royal Purple Lodges in Newfoundland and in the Maritimes. We'll be on Facebook. The Canadian Royal Purple will be on Facebook and Instagram and any kind of social media to tell the story. Our cities and our legislatures will recognize that day. They'll light their city halls in purple. Businesses will put purple ribbons on their doors. And we ask people to wear purple on that day to recognize the cause. We'll do whatever it takes to bring awareness and to stop the violence and the brain injuries that result from that violence. That's the role of the volunteer. We are not the people who will be able to look after the brain injured population once it's happened. For us, It's to deal with the brain injuries that are preventable. And that's a job we can do. It's the Canadian Royal Purple and Brain Love's dream. And we are a team of volunteers ready to share with the researchers and the brain injury associations 365 days a year, not just one, to bring in awareness and increase that awareness about this 100% preventable cause of brain injuries. That's what Royal Purple is all about. And if you'd love to volunteer, talk to me after we're done. And so, as a part of my very great pleasure today, I get to introduce a very personable young researcher who really doesn't want to stay in the ivory tower. She wants to get out in the public and tell the story about her research. Danielle Toccalino is a PhD candidate in health services research. She tells me that's a fancy way to say she looks at health systems, structures, and policies. She comes from a neuroscience and brain injury background. She works with an interdisciplinary team led by Dr. Angelo Colantonio of the Acquired Brain Injury Research Lab, University of Toronto. She is the professional dealing in facts and stats that will validate the importance of understanding the impact of brain injuries in our world. Danielle, it's all yours.
She asked me for some notes for what to say for an intro, and that's you took that and ran with it. Thanks, Sandy. All right. Well, hi everybody. I'm so happy to be here. A part of my heart will always belong in Halifax and in Nova Scotia. I think the very first time I came to visit, I brought to this library and it was shown off at this amazing spot. So it's really, really a pleasure for me to be here today. Pardon me as I get my notes up and running because I'm used to seeing presenter view over there and I can't do that when the computer's over there. All right, so as Sandy mentioned, technically I'm an academic, right? And research has its place, but I think it's really important to recognize that research, yes, there's a utility to research, but really the goal of research should be to create something that can have an impact out in the real world, right? So if researchers are not connected to the front line, to the people who are actually experiencing the problem that we're researching, we're kind of useless, right? So that's part of why I love doing things like this, because I can actually come out and we can make sure that the research that we're doing is actually kind of has some kind of a tangible impact. If we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And before we start, I know that we did a land acknowledgement for land of Halifax. I work in Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And it's part of the Dish with One Spoon covenant, which is this really beautiful idea of sharing resources and communing as peoples together, with the understanding that we're all sharing from this one dish and this one spoon. And I think particularly when it comes to health research, which is the broader scope of what I do, as well as when we're talking about intimate partner violence, to really recognize what a profound impact colonialism has had on the Indigenous peoples of these lands, but also on all of us, right? And what that means for what we need to do in terms of reconciliation moving forward and making sure that our health systems are built for everybody and are encouraging and incorporating all of the aspects of healthcare and healing that we really need to serve the entirety of our nation's population. Perfect. All right, so what is intimate partner violence? It is any behavior by an intimate partner. It can be a spouse, current, former, or other partner, boyfriend, girlfriend, that causes physical, sexual, or psychological harm. Oftentimes we think of hitting, but it can also include, so we've got physical aggression. It can also include sexual coercion or sexual aggression, psychological abuse, and other forms of abuse. financial abuse is a really common one, particularly among individuals living with disability. The global, nope, that's perfect, thank you. The World Health Organization estimates 1 in 3 women globally will experience intimate partner violence at some point in their lifetime, particularly physical and sexual violence. And a lot of times I have people look at that statistic and they're like, okay, well, Danielle, that's a global statistic, so it can't be that bad here, right? And unfortunately, it's worse. So in Canada, this is the most recent Statistics Canada figure. It's based on 2018 data. So for everybody who's lived through the pandemic, we know that these numbers are probably worse now, unfortunately. But 44% of Canadian women and 36% of Canadian men will experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And this is worse among specific demographic groups within those populations. I'm only showing these handful here because that was all that was available in the Statistics Canada report. It's in no way saying that these are the only groups that are important, but particularly women living with disability, Indigenous women, and sexual minority women and men experience higher rates of intimate partner violence than the broader women or men population. And again, we've got a gender binary here that is not indicative of our actual population, but again, problems with data. And about half of those individuals will experience physical violence specifically. So from that whole list of things that can go into intimate partner violence, half of them will experience some kind of physical violence. Now, this physical violence, a lot of it concentrates injury to the head, face, and neck, which leaves survivors at high risk of brain injury, understandably. So our current research shows a range for a lot of reasons, and I'm happy to chat about that later, but for the sake of brevity, a range of between 20 and 75% of survivors, particularly women survivors, will experience a brain injury as a result of that physical violence. If we split the difference there, so we've got 25% or so of women in Canada experiencing intimate partner violence. Let's say 50% of them will experience brain injury as a result. That statistic's 1 in 8 will experience brain injury as a result of intimate partner violence. That is the same statistic as breast cancer in this country. Think about how many walks for breast cancers, runs for breast cancers, tuniathons for breast cancer, all of the research that goes into or all of the money that goes into breast cancer research. And before today, or before all of the information went out about this, this presentation, how many of you had heard about intimate partner violence related brain injury? How often is it seen in the news, right? For those of you who are hockey inclined, for every NHL concussion, over 7,000 women will experience a concussion at the hands of an intimate partner. So that's some numbers to sit with. And I just came from a conference and I actually had a couple, I gave part of this spiel on the first day, and I had a couple of people coming up to me after that who were like, that number stuck. And I've been able to tell people that number. So I'm hoping some of those numbers stick. Okay, and I realize I'm probably talking to the wrong crowd, giving you an overview of what brain injury is, but we're going to do it just for anybody who might not be familiar. Brain injury is an umbrella term. There's a couple of different facets to it. Traumatic brain injury is, our lovely technical definition here, is an alteration in brain function or other evidence of brain pathology caused by an external force. Basically means you end up with a hit or blow to the head, face, or neck that causes some kind of an alteration in the way that your brain functions or in terms of your brain structure. Anoxic brain injury is another component. For those of you in the brain injury world, or if you're particularly working in brain injury research or brain injury care from a medical model perspective, often there's a distinction between these two for very good reason. But we lump them all together for intimate partner violence purposes. But anoxic brain injury is as a result of a lack of blood flow to the brain. It can be a result of strangulation, which is incredibly common in intimate partner violence. It can also be as a result of drug overdose or heart attack or anything else that kind of prevents blood circulation in the brain. And the broader umbrella of brain injury is a huge source of death and disability globally. So it's a really big issue. All right. Those are some of the kind of common causes of brain injury. And no, the next one is great. Okay. And so again, if we're looking at this in Canada, what does that look like? So these are slightly old. They're from 2013 or so. So I apologize for that. But it's not really getting any better. So the numbers still stand. The important takeaway from this graph is the fact that the first 4 columns are multiple sclerosis, HIV, spinal cord injuries, and breast cancer. They're annual rates of incidence. So the number of people that are diagnosed with or identified as having those concerns every year. And our last column is brain injury, traumatic brain injury specifically. So traumatic brain injury is an issue in Canada that is more common than all of those other concerns combined. And brain injury can happen to anybody, just as intimate partner violence can affect anybody. All right. And those are statistics I won't go into. Perfect. All right. Now, what does this mean for survivors of intimate partner violence? Now, for those of you who are involved in brain injury, these lists are probably way more familiar to you than they are to me. But there are a number of cognitive challenges that are a result of, or that can often follow a brain injury. I've got a laundry list there, but the last time I did this presentation, I was told stories speak more than my checklists. So I've got a quote for you. As part of the research that I do, I get to talk to survivors. These are spectacular women who have survived what none of us should ever have to survive, and have been so keen to share their experiences so that the next woman doesn't have to go through what they did. And one of our survivors, we've talked about a bunch of different things, but one of them shared that dealing with the stress and the physical and mental impact, it's hard to function. And it does impact your ability to think and to coordinate and to organize and to multitask. I find now I can't multitask very well at all. And this is a survivor. When she was first injured, she was a university student just like I was, right? So I think of all the things that I need to manage on a daily basis, email my supervisor. I need to be keeping track of what the deadlines are for my department, when I need to be handing things in, what I need to do in terms of my own personal life and making sure that that all jives with what my academic deadlines are. And you think of that and you think of the ability to organize and coordinate. And if you can't do that anymore, what does that mean for what you can do? And this is when we spoke to this survivor, she was 69 years old and she was injured when she was 25 and she still has trouble multitasking, and which multitasking is a different kettle of fish we can talk about later. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. Multitasking doesn't exist. It's rapid code switching, really. But that ability to kind of switch between things, keep track of things, it's a real challenge. All right, let me go to the next. Perfect. Physical challenges. Again, a laundry list of things that you can experience after a brain injury. But we had survivors share headaches are a huge thing, right? And I ended up, this is the same survivor, I ended up with headaches at one point for 5 years, and they developed finally into constant migraines. So I've suffered with them for the last 45 years or something like that. Still experiencing them. And with violence, intimate partner violence in particular, it's violence in your home, right? Which can also lead to post-traumatic stress disorder, all sorts of concerns around your safety. And the second quote here just highlights the fact that because it was violence in her home and violence that often happened at night, she also suffers with insomnia. And then psychological challenges, and we'll talk a little bit more about this because this is one of the pieces that's in our title for today. There's all sorts of psychological and mental health impacts to brain injury and to intimate partner violence. So if we share one of our survivors who had a really challenging time with the fact that she's still a number of years after, a couple of decades actually, after, was still taking antidepressants. So she ended up with depression after her injury, after her most recent, or her last episode, I suppose, of intimate partner violence, and that she was hospitalized for it. And she's still on antidepressants. And the recognition that that's kind of a lifelong thing that she's had to deal with and grapple with. And a lot of both the anxiety and the depression were catalyzed by that intimate partner violence experience, the things that she didn't have to experience prior to that. Okay, which brings us to this lovely trifecta. That's actually a horrible trifecta. So we've talked about the intimate partner violence and brain injury relationship. individuals experiencing intimate partner violence are at high risk of brain injury. We also see that individuals with brain injury are at high risk of experiencing intimate partner violence. So that's a bidirectional relationship. And actually, more broadly, individuals living with disability are at high rates of being taken advantage of quite broadly. But intimate partner violence is one facet of that. Now, independently, mental health and intimate partner violence and mental health and brain injury are both very well recognized in the literature. It's this kind of trifecta that is less well recognized, and that's part of what I'm really interested in doing in with my PhD. And there's a serious, there's a recognized relationship between these three pieces. So there's a lot of numbers up on the slide here. The main takeaway here is that prevalence of mental health concerns, particularly depression, anxiety, and PTSD, in survivors of intimate partner violence with brain injury is quite high. In some cases, it's up to 100% of study samples. These are study samples, take that with a grain of salt. They're small groups of people, but still, it's a pretty serious impact. And what I find really interesting, again, this is my kind of nerdy brain going on things, but there's a relationship there. So we have scores for, we have ways to score mental health concerns and to score brain injury. People who score higher on brain injury scales also tend to score higher on PTSD, depression, and anxiety scales. So the worse your brain injury is, or the more seriously you're impacted by your brain injury, the more seriously you are likely to be impacted by a mental health concern. All right. And so now we get into, I'm going to talk about some of the research that we've done, trying to identify things that we need to do to change moving forward. So hopefully you can all leave here with some hope that we can move in the right direction. So one of these papers is published. The other one is my PhD thesis, which I am very much hoping we will have published soon so that I can graduate. But I know, thank you. Yes, we're hoping, fingers crossed. So we hosted a national summit actually it was the very end of the first year of COVID that brought together, we wanted to bring together IPV experts, TBI experts, and health experts. And we're using the term expert in the not professionalized way of the term, right? So we're bringing survivors who are experts in their lived experience, who are experts in how these pieces all come together and manifest in individuals. We brought together researchers and we brought together service providers in all three of those spheres to answer two questions. First, we wanted to identify key needs, facilitators, and barriers to care, as well as co-create ideas for resources and supports. Someone might have that sheet, but that's where that sheet came from. And I'll talk about that in a second. And then the part that's related to my thesis was a qualitative research study. It wasn't that kind of national summit, but we went out and talked to people. And I guess okay, yeah, that's great. So we wanted to look at what are brain injury, sorry, I've got acronyms up there, BI, brain injury, and MH, mental health related needs and experiences of IPV survivors related to healthcare and healing specifically, as well as what are the challenges to providing or receiving care that is related to that. And for this group, we focused on mental health as part of that healthcare experience. And interestingly, we looked at employers too, but I'm not going to talk about that today. Okay, perfect. So experiences with care. Overwhelmingly, the survivors that we talked about IPV, brain injury, mental health. Very clear that it's a whole big ball of all-togetherness. It's really, really complicated. And in some cases, not beneficial to parse out all of the different pieces. And all of those different pieces have kind of compounding effects. So one of our survivors shared that I think with the mental health side of it and the IPV together, it melts together. When you have just the IPV or the TBI, you lose a lot of yourself. So it's like a cumulative effect, and you just keep getting pushed down until you feel like you're less than the scum on the bottom of someone's shoe. And this lived experience of having all of those compounding factors, and in a lot of instances, not having being able to identify the fact that some of those components were actually compounding factors, survivors said that they felt they were worthless. They thought it was just them. They thought they were crazy. And being able to identify what those pieces were and put a name to something was actually really empowering for them. They also talked about finding care as being a full-time job. So one of our survivors spoke about a particularly violent experience with her partner, where anybody in brain injury would look at that and say, okay, clearly if he smashed my head up against the wall over a dozen times, there is very, very likely to be a brain injury there, right? And when I phoned my family doctor, she said, just go to Emerge. And I had actually finally gone to Emerge, and they said, just go to your family doctor. And I said, I want a scan. And they said, okay, no, we don't do that. I'm sure you're fine. Here, do you need some antidepressants? Do you need some sleeping pills? It took me 2 months to see my family doctor, knowing what had happened to me. 2 months. And all she did was dismiss it. And she went on to tell us that when she advocated for herself, told her family doctor, you know, you're not giving me the kind of care that I need, her family doctor dismissed her and took her off her roster. And this is one particularly easily quotable example of this being bounced back and forth, but it was a really common experience. You have survivors who go somewhere for help. They're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know. I don't believe you. You're probably fine. Go home, go talk to somebody else. Oh, we've got too long of a wait list. We don't even have a wait list because we're so overwhelmed. And then you end up with people bouncing back and forth. And if we go back to those cognitive challenges, right? The ability to multitask, the ability to organize, the ability to keep track of things, that's a lot of cognitive effort to put on someone who's potentially very severely injured. Okay, so now if we flip to the experiences of providing care. So we talked about that all of those pieces of all togetherness, right? The intimate partner violence pieces, the brain injury pieces, the mental health pieces, and the fact that they're this complicated bundle. I'm thinking about it in my head as like this ball of yarn that you don't know where any of the threads stop and start. Our service providers said that it's really important actually to know that all of those pieces are there. You don't, and if you, yeah, perfect. You don't actually necessarily need to know what is what, but you need to know all the pieces are there, because so often, particularly in IPV, the brain injury gets ignored and they are treating everything as if it's a mental health concern. So we had a frontline worker who said, I wonder how often we're maybe not helping our clients because we're like, oh, there's a mental health issue here. And we're using all of our mental health tools, but it's not a mental health concern, right? It's impacting the person's mental health, but we're not equipping them with the right support. So being able to recognize there's a brain injury there means that you can support them for the brain injury and the mental health piece. If the mental health piece is, I don't want to say true mental health, but if those kinds of supports will help them. Which then leads us into the fact that care provision requires a toolbox full of strategies. So, and I really love this visual, but this was one of our program coordinators who talked about having a toolbox full of strategies that we can try and just kind of go through the list. This one might not work. We're going to try it for a little bit. If it works, great. We've got something that helps you. If it doesn't, we'll go to the next thing on the list, and that's fine. And having that toolkit that you can work with means that you then don't end up with survivors who are labeled as treatment resistant or difficult, or who, for whatever reason, are people that we can't help because this one tool that I'm used to working with doesn't work in this case. Perfect. And of course, if we're going through a whole toolkit, we also need a flexible approach and a collaborative approach. So this was the same coordinator was talking about the fact that the women that they're dealing with, they do have a really wonderful program that's brain injury and mental health that combines the two of them. And she was talking about the fact that the women that we're working with still need both. They need brain injury experts. They need mental health experts. They just need those two often siloed kind of channels to talk to each other so that they can work together to support the survivor in the best way that they can. All right. Which then brings us to, what do we need to do with our health system? And as Sandy mentioned at the top, I'm a health services researcher, so I just came from a conference where we were talking all about problems with our health systems across the country. But we have a couple of things, small little tasks. Incredible sarcasm here for anybody that would be really great for us to start to tackle. And this is part of the work that came out of that summit that is published if anybody is so inclined to read it. But these are the Coles notes and the highlights. We really need trauma-informed, anti-racist, and equitable care systems across the country. We heard time and time again how for Black women, for Indigenous women, previous experiences with racism in a healthcare setting meant that we didn't want to go and seek care. And one of the things that I'm sure you're aware in brain injury is a problem. You have people who think, oh, it's not that big of a problem, I'm not going to go. IPV, similarly, you have a huge problem with people not seeking care. A lot of that is also due to fear of retribution from the abuser. But that additional barrier to finding care, to actually wanting to seek out care in the first place because you're pretty sure you're not going to be treated the way that you would like to be treated, is huge, and we need to work on that. We also need to make sure that the care that people receive is care that's culturally sensitive, that's appropriate for those individuals, and it's the care that they would like to be receiving. And I kind of said, as I said off the top, right, the colonial history of Canada has had huge impacts on Indigenous women and Two-Spirit individuals in particular. And that has played a huge role in the severity of gender-based violence in those communities. So we need to work really hard to address that. And to that to that collaborative approach, I guess, is the need for cross-pollination of knowledge across disciplines, which is another reason why I love doing things like this, because we should have done a poll at the beginning. Where is everybody? What kind of spheres and sectors are everybody working in? But there needs to be more education and awareness so that people are putting these things together automatically, right? I loved this quote, that you have to understand the context, the dynamic of violence to understand why and how. So the need to put IPV and TBI together when people are coming in, so that you're understanding that those two pieces are going to play a role and have some kind of an interrelatedness, and that we need to work through both of those pieces and the mental health piece in addition. And the fact that when you do that, when you've got people who are aware, regardless of what kind of a sector they're in, if they encounter a survivor who they think, you know what, I think there might be some brain injury pieces here, I think there might be some mental health concerns here, they know what they're looking at. And even if they personally can't help, they know to recognize it and then might be able to point someone on to the right direction. So the end of that quote there, just, you don't have to know everything about this. You just make sure that every door is the right door. Which then, and anybody working in healthcare, I'm sure this is something that you are very familiar with, the need for integrated and coordinated care, right? We have so many incredible professionals working in very specific areas of expertise, and that is important and valuable. And we need to make sure that those very distilled pockets of people who have incredible depth of expertise are connected to those other areas of expertise, so that women aren't falling through the cracks. And I actually think I might have taken it out, but there was a great quote about the fact that the gaps in our system aren't actually gaps, they're massive chasms, and they're eating people whole. And particularly with intimate partner violence and brain injury too, to an extent, we don't really know what that touch point is going to be, right? There isn't if you think about heart attacks, for an example, typically, not always, often there will be some kind of an instance that result in you ending up in the emergency department. People identify you're having a heart attack or cardiac arrest. I think that was where, and then they identify kind of next steps, and they put you on the right pathway to get whatever testing you need. Clearly, I'm not a heart person. But with intimate partner violence, we don't have that kind of a process, right? Because there isn't a one frontline worker, one first responder that's going to be the person or the profession that intervenes in every case. And in a lot of cases, the person who intervenes is going to be someone 10, 15 years down the road, right? It will be after if that person has chosen to leave their abusive relationship, it'll be after they've left and they've got these weird lingering memory issues or lingering headaches or lingering pain. And that's when you might need to do a little bit of a deeper dive into okay, well, did you ever have a brain injury and what can we do for you now? Right. So a lot of information spewed at you in a relatively short period of time. And the other feedback I got from our last presentation is I'm supposed to give you action items. So first thing that everybody can do, regardless of who you are or what you do, is tell somebody, right? Have this conversation with someone. That 1 in 8 statistic, that 1 in 7,000 statistic, even to the general awareness that intimate partner violence is very common and that brain injury is a likely result. If you start having those conversations with your loved ones, with your friends, with colleagues, that just starts to raise awareness. And then hopefully we will get to the point where both this is not, as Sandy is saying, prevention's the best. The only cure is prevention. That's the one. Right? If we can get to that point where this is something that we're all aware of, then hopefully we will be able to provide better supports and broader awareness so that people are finding the supports that they need. If you are working in frontline in any context, consider brain injury. If you're a brain injury professional, you already do this by training, then consider intimate partner violence. Think about whether or not those things might be playing a role in the populations that you're serving. And then think about what you might be able to do, even if you're not in a position to treat or actively support from a medical perspective, healing from a brain injury. There's things that you can do. Provide written information, right? You can provide spaces that are less noisy, less bright, phone call reminders for follow-up, right? To make sure that people are reminded that they've got an appointment coming in. One of the things that we really heard in frontline IPV workers, they got incredibly frustrated with their survivors, the survivors they were working with, because they just wouldn't show up to things. And they're like, oh, she doesn't care enough to come in and do anything. You know, she doesn't care to do the homework that I've assigned her from our last session. She doesn't care. She doesn't remember. So give her those tools. All right. And if you are working in frontline and you are in a position to be supporting survivors of brain injury, survivors of IPV, build your toolbox of strategies. Talk to colleagues. If you're working in brain injury, talk to your mental health colleagues. If you're working in mental health, talk to your brain injury colleagues, IPV colleagues across the board. See what you can do, little things within your scope of practice. I appreciate there's things that you can and cannot do, but see what you can do and adopt into your own practice, which leads into the next and last one is build out those networks. So things that you can't do within your own scope of practice, who can you then refer to make sure that that individual is getting the care without throwing her to the proverbial wolves and having her bounce between her family doctor and her emergency room and there and this, that, and the other, and not being able to find the support that she needs. Okay. And this is a laundry list. So I've got 3 things that I can send you away with that you can actually look at and keep using. The first is the Abuse and Brain Injury Toolkit. We have a version 2.0 that is hopefully coming out very, very soon. But this is the incredible work of my supervisor, Angela Colantonio, and my wonderful colleague, Lynn Hogg. It's www.abitoolkit.ca or .com. We've got both, and I should have had a code on this slide, but alas. But it's actually not. But we've got that give towards brain injury or towards IPV professionals to give them information about brain injury. But we've got lots of that kind of cross-cutting stuff and easily things that you can implement in terms of your work with survivors, including fun infographics you can download if you'd like to. If you are not working in a brain injury space, and there might actually be a Nova Scotia specific equivalent, so I should have checked with you, and you might be able to refer people to specific local resources, but we've got concussion guidelines for persistent symptoms. This is the Ontario Neurotrauma Foundation, but those kinds of resources for understanding what appropriate protocols are within your health system are an important next step. And if, next slide, please. And if intimate partner violence is totally new to you and you want to learn more on that front in particular, as you know, I'm a brain injury researcher, not an IPV research. So there's some really incredible work coming out of the Vega project in London, Ontario, that is looking at family violence and intimate partner violence resources for healthcare practitioners in particular. So that's a great resource. And CREVAC is general learning, also highly recommend. They've got great webinars across a whole spectrum of interesting topics related to gender-based violence more broadly. All right. I want to acknowledge all the funding that we got for all of this, because unfortunately research doesn't happen unless we get money from somebody. My contact information is there. I will also obviously take questions. And if we go to the next 2 slides, I've got a whole list of incredible survivors and service providers who participated in this research, without whom this wouldn't be possible. And on the last slide are all the people who make my academic research, my PhD research possible. So thank you for that. And then I'm very happy to take questions.
Your friend of mine developed a program, traumatic brain injury research program, and when you mentioned collaborative approach, that different clinicians could come down over 5 hours and get together. And my intent, our intent to do it, Billy was new 5 years ago. We started in 2014, right next to the brain repair center. For clinicians to meet with survivors, because all you said, what I heard, makes so much sense. We struggle. I mean, my brain injury was a long time ago. My mother was my rehab, doesn't know. But certain various circles of brain injury community, and there's so much struggle. All the answers that clinicians give or medical people give bring hope to me. So there has to be a way. There's something in Bedford right now, the Bedford Commons, which is good, but ideally, a place where clinicians could visit with and help one-on-one for an hour a week would be ideal. Very much. I really appreciate it.
No, thank you. And that sounds like an incredible initiative. And yeah, it's that opportunity for informal, that opportunity for more informal, informal engagement and interaction is really important. So that sounds really awesome. I'd love to talk to you about that more. Yeah. Yeah. That makes total sense. Yep. All of that. Yes. And I'll pull up this slide here so that I can tell you the actual numbers. I don't have numbers on individuals who experienced childhood abuse, those numbers specifically. But we do know, where is this, that we have much higher much higher prevalence of brain injuries among individuals who are incarcerated. There's also a really recent study that has come out that actually looked at brain injury history in individuals who are perpetrating violence, and it's astronomical. It's the same kind of numbers that you see in survivors. So yeah, it's a huge problem. And my pie in the sky, like if we were going to fix all of this, what I would love to see is in our elementary schools, teach kids what positive, healthy relationships look like, teach kids what brain injury looks like, so that we are recognizing more of that early. We're getting kids set up to recognize their worth and their, like, what a good relationship should look and feel like, so that then we can address those problems early on and we don't end up with those downstream effects. Because it's, I mean, if you've lived with an untreated or an unidentified brain injury your entire life and you're experiencing all these challenges and you just think that it's all in your head, it's a huge challenge. So yeah. And I can find that paper for you specifically if you want like actual hard numbers. Yeah. Yes. That is true. Yes. So it's, I suppose it's less of a what brain injury always looks like and more of a, if you have an injury to your head and you experience any of these things, you're not alone. And this is what we can do. Because yes, I appreciate that. Every brain injury is so different. Yeah, totally. Every brain injury is different. And what the supports that every individual living with a brain injury needs is going to be different too. So I think the more that we know what those downstream effects might be and what supports might be useful, and we build out those toolkits, hopefully we end up with more people who recognize it and who find the supports that they need. Thank you.
One of the things that the Canadian World Purple is have a national poster contest for kids from grade 1 to grade 8. And you'll see every aspect of how brain injuries impact, and every once in a while, you'll be through that poster, that child will identify the fact that they are themselves experiencing some, level of that's not comfortable. Like one poster was just a mass of like red and blue and black colors, and you just know from your heart, you know what that kid's experiencing. One grade 1 kid produced a poster with a funny looking brain on with arms and legs sticking out. And on the bottom he wrote, "If my brain is wrecked, I'm wrecked." That in grade 1. That's the impact, that small volunteer group like ours can have within the schools.
For those monitoring online, do we have anything in the Q&A?
Awesome. And our number is 5 to 75% of the estimates for brain injury among perpetrators of IPV, 5 to 75. Yeah. And again, one of the struggles with research in this kind of research in brain injury is people assess for brain injury in very different ways. And because getting a formal diagnosis is really challenging in this population, you've got really wide ranges like that. But yeah. 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 Totally. And if the assumption is that you're showing up drunk or intoxicated in some way, then you're not, though that can look like brain injury can look like that, right? So yeah, it's huge problem. Yeah, if you can't, it's like if your like locomotion is a challenge, yeah, it's a struggle. Yes. That is a really great question. And we see it across the board. I wish I had the stats can to, there was differences by province. And it's the worst. Yeah. 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 So. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. Because of the pandemic. We across the board, we've seen an uptick in intimate partner violence, period, with the pandemic. I haven't actually seen any geographic breakdowns of whether it's gotten worse in some areas versus others. So that would be really something really interesting to look into. But overall, COVID has made everything worse, unfortunately.
Coming to shelters who have
Yeah. Yeah. Some of them are saying like up to a 300% increase, which is ridiculous. All right. Okay. Emily, I'll pass it back to you then.
Primarily just wanted to thank Danielle for coming all this way through the smoky air, unfortunately, to be with us today. So we really appreciate that. I have a small token, but it's on the other table, so I'll get it for you after. And again, thank you to Glenda from Saskatchewan, to Sandy as well, and the folks that made this possible for them to come all this way from the prairies to come and join us today. And I hope it's really the beginning. You were talking about connections, removing those silos. Cross-pollination, I think, was a phrase that I really like that you had up there. So I'm hoping that some of you would be willing to have some further conversations with us about how perhaps we can kind of share our expertise so that we can develop some programming and supports to really meet these dual survivors, I'll call them, where they are, because we know that's kind of some unique situation that they find themselves in. So if anybody wants to chat, I'm happy to. I have some business cards I can share around and hopefully can connect again. Great. Thanks, everybody.